Well, thank you, everybody, for coming. There's so many of you, which is both very exciting and a little scary. So I'm excited to tell you all about my game project I've been working on since the very end of my junior year. This game project was kind of targeted around one core problem that I and many other computer science game students have, which is that we're very good at starting games, but very bad at finishing them. We usually have lots of ideas and lots of grand game mechanics written down in our notebooks and our spreadsheets, but actually getting to the finish line and being able to publish those games is a really big challenge, and some people don't even know where to get started. I sure didn't for the first 2 years that I was in computer science, but really the history of me wanting to make games goes back even a little bit farther than that. So I'm here today to tell you how I overcame this problem by giving myself a challenge. I was going to make one game every month, starting in April of 2024, which, as I said, was the very end of my junior year. Through this challenge, I've been able to make 8 games that have been uploaded to my itch page. If you don't know, itch.io is a platform that developers can publish their projects to. It allows you to publish your games for free, and I also choose to make mine free to play. So I'll put my link at the very end, and if anybody wants to check out any of the games we talk about, feel free to do that. They're free to play and readily available on the web. To get into these bigger games that I've made and the other ones that I've made, I'm going to take you through the story of my first game so that we can really understand how I at first overcame this problem. So for my first game, I want to first give some context of who I was coming into college. When I came into college, I was actually an elementary education major, which is very different from computer science. I have a background in art. I took art lessons for about 10 years from elementary school to high school, so I did have some art background coming in. I play guitar, so I have a little bit of music sense, but I had absolutely zero programming experience. And that's very important to understand as I start talking about where this all came from. Related, but you might not understand yet, is that I also really like the game Stardew Valley. It was the first game that I ever played that got me into playing video games. So it played a really big part in my inspiration, and especially when I found out that this game was made by one person, it really made me also want to do that. I've always been very creative, so the idea that I could have this idea and execute on it from front to end, making the art and the music and do the programming, was just fascinating to me. For a little context on this game, it's a farming simulator where you grow crops and sell them for money, and you can also do a bunch of other things like mining and fishing and foraging and talk to the NPCs, and it's a gigantic game, enough for me to put way too many hours into it. So, since this was my inspiration, the thing that while I was still in elementary education I was thinking about was I wanted to make a game that gave me the same feeling this did. I wanted to make a game that was charming and took place in a sort of Midwest country-style town. Very familiar, you'll understand. When I first started trying to get into it, I chose Godot Game Engine because I had just heard online that it was more beginner-friendly than something like Unreal or Unity, which are other beefier game engines that are used a lot in the industry. I also invested $20 into a pixel art software because when you start a new hobby, the first thing you got to do is spend some money on it. So I had myself set, I was watching a bunch of YouTube tutorials, and I had a dream. So again, not having any programming experience, I very quickly ran into a roadblock, which is I literally don't know how to do anything in this game engine. But I tried. I wrote up lots of notes that would be the backstories of these characters. I drew up some pixel art towns. But again, without knowing how to program, I couldn't really make anything happen. And the bigger problem isn't just that I didn't know how to do it, it's that I didn't know how to learn how to do it. So eventually, just because my passions changed, I decided to switch into computer science because it better aligned with what I was interested in. And even though I started to understand what conditionals are and for loops, and I could now define a sorting algorithm, none of those things really helped in me applying those skills to this game I wanted to make. So I switched my major. I still have this idea kind of looming over me that I want this to be like my dream game that I come out with. And in my head, I was like, I can do it before I graduate high school, or college, which wasn't true. That was never going to happen. So I reached the end of my junior year, and I've made a few games in classes, but even then, when I tried to apply those skills to my own games, it was really, really difficult for me. And I was starting to feel a sense of urgency because I didn't have a portfolio to show employers. I was about to start doing job interviews to find my post-graduation job, and I just felt very lost and like I didn't know what I was doing, and I knew I had these skills, but I didn't know how to showcase them or do what I wanted to do with them. So, sitting in one of my computer science classes one day, I hear some advice in the back of my head from one of my professors who said that one of the best ways to do it is just to set a time box and to try and do it. So I told myself I have 1 week to finish up a game and to publish it on my itch.io page, which to this point had been empty, and do everything front to back, everything I can finish in 1 week. And if that doesn't work out, I might try to pivot to something else. So I can show you. So this is the point I was at when I made that decision. I had a nice pixel art building, and it has a nice little character animation, but you can't do anything. Hence me in this class deciding, OK, I need to actually try to make a game that has a real playable mechanic in it. So I don't believe I can click on it with this, so I'm going to click over here. Let's take a look at what I made in 1 week as my first 100% solo game. It might take a minute to load because the old Godot web player takes forever. So it has music. I didn't make the music, but I do have the license to use it, so it counts. So you might be asking yourself, JD, this is nothing like Stardew Valley. This is Flappy Bird. Well, yes, I made Flappy Bird in 1 week because, as I discussed earlier, there was just no way I was ever going to make Stardew Valley without making something like this first. So I'm going to close out of it so the music isn't playing this whole time. That's a different one. So once I made this first game, and I was like, wow, that actually worked. I set a time box. I was able to make a game and publish it on my website within 1 week. I was like, why don't I start doing this all the time? Way more effective than trying to make one big game that I don't even know where to start on. So after that, I decided I was going to give myself a challenge. Until the end of my senior year, I was going to make a game every month. So since summer was rolling around, that was a great time to get started on this. And one of the first lessons I learned was to manage my scope. Obviously, Stardew wasn't going to work out. I made something like Flappy Bird. That's one of the big lessons I learned through this. And as we go on, I'm going to show you some other games I've made to kind of prove these examples. Something else I learned is that it's important to find motivation in learning. And the third thing I learned is that ideas are just ideas unless you actually turn them into something. So as I said, I'll have examples as we go, but these are the 3 main keys to have in mind. So for my next point, managing scope. Some of you might be asking yourself, if I can't even finish one game, how am I supposed to go from doing that to making a game every single month? The answer is simple, even though some of us don't want to accept it, which is to make smaller games. If you had asked me when I was still an elementary education major if I wanted to make Flappy Bird, I would be like, no, I don't want to do that. That's not what I'm passionate about. But I also didn't really know what I was talking about because I'd never done it before. And now that I've done it, I'm very happy to say that these small games bring me a lot of value and they teach me a lot. So I'm going to talk about this scope lesson with some of the other first games I made. I left some timelines on there. Spade Flight was published in April. Candy Drop came out May 10th. Froggy Flower Hats came out May 27th. And Scrimble came out July 17th. So sometimes less than a month, sometimes a little bit more. I take the challenge as I can. So let's start with Candy Drop. This was my next game after I made my Flappy Bird clone. Oh, I have to actually play it. Can't do it with the clicker. Candy Drop is inspired by Suika Game, also known as Watermelon Game. It's that game you play on your phone where you drop fruits, and if 2 fruits are the same fruit, they combine into a bigger fruit. By doing this, you earn points, and the point of this game is to try to reach a high score. So I'll drop a pink candy, and then a peppermint, and then if I combine these little pink candies, it'll make a bigger candy. This is obviously a little bit more complicated than Flappy Bird, but the reason I knew that I was capable of making something a little bit bigger is because I had already made something a little bit smaller. This game I didn't have to cut any of the features out on because I had a pretty direct goal, and as I came to find out, it was within my wheelhouse to make. This is also my only game that actually has a mute button, so sorry about that. The next game, Froggy Flower Hats, is a game I had to actually cut a lot out of. After Candy Drop, I got a little bit too ambitious, and I was like, I'm going to make this frog game where you take frogs and you put them on a stump, and they want to be pampered, kind of like a spa. So they would request a food item, you'd give them the food, they'd request a flower, you'd give them a flower, and they would give you money in exchange for your spa service. Within 1 month, I realized after about 3 weeks that all was just not going to happen. I didn't have the UI expertise to figure out how to make the shop happen, and connecting everything was just too complicated. So I went smaller because as one of the rules of the challenge, I try very hard not to push my deadline back. If I'm reaching the end of the month and I still haven't completed the game, I do my best to cut features rather than push it on, because the important part of the challenge to me is that I can move on to the next thing. I can publish something, it's done, I can wipe my hands of it, and I don't have to worry about it anymore. So compared to what I wanted to make at the beginning of the month, let's see what I actually did end up making. This is a little introduction, just explaining how the game works. I'll give it a minute for our frogs to enter the scene. There's one. They're very cute, thank you. You put a frog on a stump, it thinks for a minute, and it tells you what type of flower it wants, and then you can put a flower on its head, and then he's happy, and he'll walk away with his hat. Pretty cute. You will notice, though, that there's no way to win. You don't get money, you don't get points. You can just give as many frogs flower hats as you want, and that's the game. And for me, that was enough to learn what I needed to know, wipe my hands of it, and move on. I was very, very proud of this when it came out, even though the scope of it was much smaller than I initially wanted it to be. For my final game I'll be showing in this sequence, we have Scrimble, which takes a little bit of backstory to understand what this comes from. Me and my roommate we're not very affectionate people with each other, so whenever we want attention from each other, we like go up to each other, grab each other by the shoulders, and shake each other, and we call that scrimbling. And so for her birthday, I made her a game all about doing that. Now the thing about scope in this game is that I had not read the calendar for a while and didn't realize that her birthday was coming up in 2 days. So I kind of had an impromptu game jam where I was going to make this game in 48 hours, and I did. So let's see how it turned out. It's going to be a little hard. It's better to shake with a mouse, but I'm using a trackpad. So this is kind of a mock-up of our dorm room. You can see I can shake her PS5 if I really want to. And as you shake it, you get points in the top left corner. This is the only game of mine that I actually cameo in. And if I do a whole lot of shaking, you can see there's some screen shake, and the music changes to be more intense when you're shaking something. And for being done in 48 hours, this was like astounding to me, because even though it's smaller than Froggy Flower Hats, it was less complicated. Proving to myself that I was able to do it in 48 hours was like a big deal, because all of the art, all of the music, and all of the programming was done. And from the beginning, that is what I wanted to be able to do. So I do have a strategy I want to give you if you don't quite know where your scope limit is. It can be very challenging when you're making some of your first games to know what you're capable of. And so for that one, I recommend just trying, because the best way to figure out where your limits are to test them. But if you don't even know where to start in that regard, I'm going to give us a bit of an example. So in Stardew Valley, the main mechanic you deal with is farming. And to be able to farm, you need to be able to dig, plant, water, and harvest. That by itself is not that complicated. I could see a world where a student game developer can accomplish this in 1 month, and it's a perfectly fine, cute little game. But when my dream was bigger than this, we need to also consider the other mechanics, which are that crops grow over a certain number of days, and every crop has a different number of days that it grows. Crops only grow in certain seasons, and if they're left there for too long and the next season comes, they die. There's crows that randomly can eat your plants. There's a magic fairy that can randomly make your crops grow during any day. There's a greenhouse that can grow any crop of any season, and some plants regrow after you harvest them and some don't. A little bit more complicated than we initially saw from looking at it on a surface level. That being said, this, for someone that's pretty experienced making games, might be doable in 1 month even still. But then when we expand outward a little bit more, Stardew Valley has probably 10 or more other mechanics that are just as complicated as this, and it's just something that I can't even envision how it works in my head, so how am I supposed to turn them into software? That's mostly the metric I use. If it's something that I can't even fit within the scope of my short-term memory, it's probably not something that I will be able to produce in 1 month. And to make something like Stardew Valley, it's very important to understand that it's not just like game development skills. It's like you need a very strong fundamental understanding of software engineering and how all of these objects would connect together. And so those are the 3 games I wanted to show you that talk about scope and the lessons I learned through scope. Whereas something like Flappy Bird, when we break down the mechanics of it, we have when you tap the screen, the bird goes up. Gravity affects the bird, so it comes back down if it's not going up. Player gains a point if the bird goes between the pipes without hitting them. The pipes move on the screen from right to left, and if the bird hits anything else or exits the screen, the bird dies, and the game is over. The great thing about Flappy Bird is that isn't just one mechanic of the game. This is the whole game. It's 5 bullet points, and I can check them off a list very easily and understand that this is something I can make and I can wrap my head around. So that wraps up the scope section of my lessons and my advice I would give to other students. The next thing I want to talk about is finding motivation through learning. One of the biggest obstacles that can get in the way of making games is perfectionism. I had it in my head for a long time that if a game was not going to make me any money, or if nobody was really going to look at it, then what's even the point of making it? But over time, I learned to find motivation through making these games and building confidence in myself, and also just sharing them with my friends and family. There's a million ways to get value out of games, and I especially want to talk about these next two in this regard. So, on August 29th, 2024, Professor Harris will recognize this game because an assignment in his class is what sparked it. I was challenged to make a Godot choose-your-own-adventure game. Well, I was challenged to make any choose-your-own-adventure game. Me having this challenge where I make a game every month, I went a little overboard with it and built the whole thing in Godot because I really wanted to learn how to make a text box. And I didn't want it to just be text that shows up. I wanted it to scroll, and I wanted, most importantly, if players don't want to read it, the ability to skip it a whole bunch. So I did that. But because I spent so much time working on this text box mechanic, I also had to drop some of the other areas of the game I would have put more emphasis on. So it's a murder mystery game, but the game never tells you who the murderer is. You just kind of observe the hints from going through the story, and you're supposed to figure it out on your own. No verification. And that would have bothered me a lot more at the beginning because it's like, well, I show this to someone. I literally showed it to my friends, and they were like, okay, but who's the murderer? And I was like, well, it's about that, but for me, it was mostly about learning. That was the value I got out of it. And we actually see in the very next game how that value came to fruition. With Grit and Old Glitter, this was a game I made for a 48-hour game jam. It was the first game jam I ever did fully on my own. You'll notice that I use the exact same text box system. And this is a point that is very important for me because for a long time I just had that idea that the value of my games came from other people instead of coming from me. So when I was challenged to make a game of 48 hours for this game jam, I was like, well, I can just use the text box system and then spend time learning how to connect that with the other mechanics of the game. So in here, you scroll through the text, you read the little story, and one of the little mini games is that you dig up some trinkets from the desert. So I'm going to dig them all up. I got that many, and then my character is going to walk back to their city, and you're going to try to sell these trinkets that are basically trash. You're going to sell them. You're going to sell them to these villagers, lying to them about what they are to try to get them to buy it so that you can get money. That's the whole game. So this person wants something evil. I'm going to pick the evil option. They give me 10 bones, which is the currency. Being able to reference my own work was a very cool feeling that I'd never really done before. I've done other homework assignments for other classes where I had to look back and see how I do something, but it had never showed itself in the same way this did, where I really saw a lot of value in having a portfolio, not just for other people to reference, but for me to reference. So learning to find the joy in just learning new things and not putting that pressure on myself was a really big deal for me. My last point and my last lesson I want to really spend time talking about is accepting the fact that ideas are just ideas and the value of them comes from what you do with them. Some people might ask, how could you spend 2 years on a game just for it to end up being Flappy Bird? And to that I say, well, I didn't spend 2 years on Flappy Bird. I spent 2 years on this idea of making a game. I spent 1 week on Flappy Bird. And I just want to point out that it's very interesting that I was able to accomplish far more in 1 week than I ever was in 2 years. So even though I spent all that time writing notes and coming up with backstories for my characters, all of that, it's just ideas until I was able to do something with any of them. As fun as ideas are, they're not inherently worth anything, and everyone can come up with ideas all the time. Brainstorming is important when you're coming up with an idea for a big project. For example, the game Capstone, where you're going to be working on it for a year. You want that idea to be pretty good because halfway through the semester, you can't just change the game completely. You don't have time. Listen to it from me. But when you have this 1 month limit on the games you're making, it's very important to spend less time on the brainstorming and more time taking a fun idea you come up with and then turning it into something. In my opinion, the best thing you can do for this project, if you decide to take it on, is to kind of game design as you go and have your main focus just be getting something that's playable, even if it's not very fun. I think in a lot of ways, the point of this challenge is to be able to be good at finishing games. And if you are constantly brainstorming and starting new projects because you don't end up liking a project, then you never actually develop the skill of finishing a game. So as a bit of a nice game to wrap this up with is my last game I'll be showing for this demonstration. It's called Henny and Roo, and it's not the most recent game I've made, but I feel like it concludes nicely because it's the closest I have to a Stardew Valley clone. This game was made in September, or it was published in September. And I got a splash screen now, so we're getting fancy. And this game is about raising chickens. You buy chickens with your money. The chickens lay eggs. You can sell the eggs for money, and then you can use that money to buy more chickens. That's the whole cycle. Again, a lot of these games don't really have a clear-cut way to win. I don't get that far when I'm developing them. What I mostly care about is the mechanics. And something that I kind of want to point out about this is even though I am, at this point, I think 6 months into the project when I made this game, I still can't make Stardew Valley. This is about as close as I can get. And that idea is something that's been hovering over me for a long time, and it was very rewarding to see me be able to have the same idea, but develop this much further than I ever was that initial kind of prototype where the character is just walking around the buildings. This has substance to it, and I can compare them directly and see that with the same idea, I was able to do two completely different things. And that was a big piece of growth for me. For some of my concluding thoughts, more than anything, doing this challenge has taught me that completing something is its own skill. It feels good to start a new project that you're super excited about, but for me, it's almost become more fulfilling to be able to complete something. I can post it to my website, and I know that anyone that looks at it will see a finished product. I've gotten over the idea that my games need to be something big for them to be successful, because these games have been very successful for me. In my most recent job interview, they asked me about my concentration in game design because I was interviewing for an integrations consultant position, which, if you'd believe it, is not a game design position. And they were like, so what do you do with that? And I was able to, like on their laptop, have them look up my website, and I had the confidence that no matter what they clicked on, it would be something that I was proud of. It would be playable, and it would showcase a handful of software engineering skills that I had developed along the way. It was way more impressive than pulling up that half-baked Stardew Valley clone that I had worked on for 2 years. Something I also want to emphasize is that all of this has happened after my junior year of college. If you feel like you are behind, or you feel like this is something you can't do and that you should have started doing 2 years ago, that's the great thing about time boxes. If you just make a game in 1 week, you now have a game after 1 week. So that's also been very rewarding to me, that I feel like after these 2 years of being kind of stuck in my position, I was able to make not just one, but many projects that showcase the skills I've developed and learn a lot through it. And I also want to conclude by emphasizing the importance of taking these techniques that we talked about and of following the rules of the challenge. I really do think that if you want to make games, this is the best way to do it. I think that coming in with too high of expectations or coming in with this big dream idea is setting yourself up for failure because you just don't know how to do it yet, and that's okay. Learning is not just about learning the knowledge, but learning how to learn something. The act of making a game every month and sticking to that not only shows others what you're capable of, but it also proves to you that you can build your confidence and you can do hard things. You can learn difficult things, which is something that you can take with you everywhere, not just in game development. These are my different areas. You can contact me or follow me with my different things, so feel free to do that.
Thank you, Jade. That was excellent.